From grief to purpose, transforming pain into power. Recently had the privilege of sitting down with Alia Henton-Williams, a woman whose very existence defies the gravitational pull of tragedy. When faced with the unimaginable loss of two siblings to violent crime, Aaliyah didn't just survive, she transformed. She didn't just endure, she elevated. Her journey from crushing grief to profound purpose represents not just personal resilience, but a masterclass in how human beings can alchemize their deepest pain into community changing power. Grief, as many of us know, doesn't politely knock before entering our lives. It doesn't send a calendar invitation or wait for a convenient moment. It kicks down the door, shatters the windows, and rewrites the architecture of our existence without consent or warning. One moment, life follows its expected trajectory, and the next, everything familiar lies in ruins. But what happens after the funeral flowers wilt? After the casseroles stop arriving? After the world's attention shifts elsewhere while you're still trying to remember how to breathe without it hurting? This is the territory I want to explore with you today. Not just how we survive the unsurvivable, but how some remarkable individuals find ways to create meaning from what initially seems meaningless. When Aaliyah shared her insight that grief doesn't shrink, we grow around it, I found myself nodding in recognition of a profound truth. The pain doesn't disappear, the loss doesn't become acceptable, but somehow, impossibly, we can expand beyond it. The journey from victim to advocate is rarely linear. It's messy, contradictory, and deeply personal. Yet, across communities, particularly in Black communities where violence has claimed far too many lives, we see extraordinary examples of people who refuse to let tragedy have the final word in their story. Consider Tamar Manasseh from Chicago's South Side. After watching violence claim friends and community members, she didn't retreat into the understandable sanctuary of private grief. Instead, she founded an organization with a name that captures both the anguish and the determination: Mothers Against Senseless Killings, MASK. Her approach was deceptively simple, yet revolutionary. Mothers physically occupied the street corners where violence frequently occurred. They brought folding chairs and set them up right where dealers and gangs usually stood. They brought food because breaking bread together creates community. They brought conversation because isolation feeds fear. Most importantly, they brought their maternal presence to space previously defined by danger. The results were remarkable. Shootings decreased significantly in those areas. Children played outside again. A community began to reclaim itself from the shadow of violence. And it all began with one woman who transformed her grief into action. When I mentioned this to Aaliyah, she nodded with knowing recognition. Sometimes, she said, the most powerful response to violence is creating spaces where it simply cannot thrive. There's profound wisdom there. Not fighting darkness directly, but illuminating it out of existence. This isn't isolated to Chicago. In Queens, New York, Erica Ford founded Life Camp after witnessing countless losses to street violence. The pain of burying friend after friend could have consumed her. Instead, it fueled her determination to break the cycle. Her organization deployed what they called peacekeepers, crisis intervention teams trained to de escalate conflicts before they turn deadly. They provided therapy services specifically designed for Black communities dealing with trauma and grief from homicide, recognizing that healing must be culturally responsive to be effective. The outcomes were measurable: significant drops in shootings and homicides in targeted neighborhoods. But beyond statistics, something more profound happened. People began talking about their pain instead of burying it. In communities where stoicism has often been a necessary survival strategy, people began to speak their grief aloud. They began to heal together rather than suffer alone. Let that sink in. In neighborhoods where staying strong and keeping it together had been the unwritten rule, people began acknowledging vulnerability. They began to understand that healing isn't weakness, it's courage in its purest form. When trauma goes unaddressed, it doesn't simply vanish, it transforms. It becomes depression, addiction, volatile anger, or emotional numbness. It ripples through families for generations, creating patterns that seem impossible to break. But when we create spaces where pain can be acknowledged, where grief is given dignity, we interrupt that cycle. We create possibility where there was only repetition. In Philadelphia, Dr. Dorothy Johnson Spate faced every parent's nightmare when her 24-year-old son, Khalik, was murdered during an argument over a parking space. The sheer senselessness of it, a young life ended over something so trivial, could have drowned her in bitterness. Instead, she founded Mothers in Charge, an organization supporting decade mothers who have lost children to violence. What began as a small support group has expanded to multiple cities, helping hundreds of families navigate not just the emotional aftermath of homicide, but also the often confusing legal processes that follow. Dr. Johnson's spite transformed her devastation into a lifeline for others, creating meaning from the seemingly meaningless. When I shared these stories with Aaliyah, she pointed out something crucial. Notice that in each case, healing wasn't a solitary journey, community was essential. And she's absolutely right. There's something transformative about finding others who understand your specific pain, not just intellectually, but viscerally. People who don't flinch when you need to talk about your loved one for the hundredth time. People who don't check their watches when your grief doesn't follow a convenient timeline. People who understand that some wounds don't heal completely, and that's okay. This brings me to the second key insight from my conversation with Aaliyah. Healing happens in community. We are not meant to carry our heaviest burdens alone, but community doesn't always exist ready made. Sometimes we have to create it, especially when our particular pain feels isolating, or when society would prefer we grieve quietly, privately, invisibly. I'm reminded of Audre Lorde's powerful words. Caring for myself is not self indulgence, it is self preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. For Black women, especially, who have historically carried the weight of family and community care, creating space for collective healing is indeed revolutionary. The women we've discussed today, Tamar, Erica, Dorothy, and Aaliyah, all recognized that their personal healing was inseparable from community healing. Their pain became purposeful, not just for themselves, but for others walking similar paths. This brings me to the third insight from my conversation with Aaliyah. We each have the power to shape our narratives. Society often assigns the label victim to those who have experienced violence or loss. It's a label that can feel suffocating, defining a person by their worst moment rather than their entire life. But what these women demonstrate is the power of reclaiming your story. You are not just what happened to you are also what you choose to do with what happened to you. This isn't about toxic positivity or suggesting that tragedy is somehow a blessing in disguise. That would be both cruel and false. Loss is loss, pain is pain. Some things can never be made right, but within that reality, we still have choices about how we carry our stories forward. When Aaliyah lost her siblings, the world may have seen a victim, but she chose to become an advocate. She chose to use her understanding of grief to create spaces where others could find support. She chose to transform her pain into purpose. This isn't unique to her. Throughout history, some of our most powerful movements for justice have been led by those who experienced injustice firsthand. Their pain became fuel for change. I want to be clear. This path isn't for everyone, and it's not a requirement for proper grieving. Some pain is simply to be endured. Some losses never find purpose, and that's okay too. But for those who do feel called to transform their grief into action, the impact can be profound, not just for others, but for themselves as well. Purpose doesn't erase pain, but it can give it meaning. It can provide a reason to get up in the morning when grief makes that seem impossible. As Aaliyah told me, the work doesn't make the grief go away, but it gives the grief somewhere to go. I've been thinking about that statement for days. Grief needs movement, it needs expression. When we channel it into creating something, whether that's an organization, a support group, or simply a more compassionate approach to others who are suffering, we honor both our pain and our capacity to heal. So, what does this mean for you? Perhaps you're carrying grief right now. Perhaps you're supporting someone who is. Or perhaps you're simply trying to make sense of the violence and loss that permeates our world. I challenge you today to consider how pain, yours or others, might be transformed rather than simply endured. I challenge you to see the revolutionary potential in creating spaces where healing can happen collectively. I challenge you to recognize that in a world where violence and loss touch too many lives, your response matters. When Tamar Manasseh placed chairs on violent street corners, she didn't just reduce crime statistics, she reclaimed humanity in places where it had been denied. When Erica Ford trained peacekeepers, she didn't just prevent shootings, she created a new narrative about what community safety could look like. When Dr. Dorothy Johnson Spate gathered grieving mothers, she didn't just provide comfort, she built power. And when Alia Henton-Williams chose to speak about her siblings, not just as victims, but as people whose legacy continues through her advocacy, she didn't just find personal healing. She created pathways for others to do the same. These aren't just inspiring stories, they're invitations. Invitations to see grief not as an endpoint, but as a potential beginning. Invitations to understand that while we cannot always choose what happens to us, we can choose what happens through us. The path from grief to purpose isn't about getting over loss, it's about growing around it, through it, with it. It's about allowing pain to transform not just into purpose, but into a deeper capacity for compassion, for justice, for love. This is your call to action. Don't just witness transformation, be part of it, create it. Whether through formal organizations or quiet conversations, whether through policy change or personal presence, find ways to channel grief, yours or others, into healing spaces that didn't exist before. Because in the end, this is how we honor those we've lost. Not by forgetting, but by remembering in ways that create change. Not by moving on, but by moving forward with purpose. Not by diminishing grief, but by allowing it to expand our capacity for creating a more just, compassionate world. The choice is yours. The time is now. and the world is waiting for the transformation only you can bring.